Well, we've finally made it into 2021 and I'm absolutely delighted to have you guys here on board the channel today. Now, this is my long-awaited Q&A. It's been way back in, I think it was about November last year when we first started talking about this, and I asked you guys to send through some questions. Well, I've got plenty of those today. Now, before we get started here, the first thing I want to say is, look, I don't set myself up to know everything about nightscape or astrophotography in the slightest. All I know is what I know. And so, therefore, those of you who look to me for advice and suggestions and things like that, well, I'm very happy to give that, but it is really only my experience that I'm able to share with you. And so there's plenty of other people out there with some absolutely awesome advice as well. So with that in mind, let's get into the questions, and if I can help someone along the way, then that's what this is all about. Okay, so Dave Long has asked their first question. Richard, regarding your lens warmers, do you use them all throughout the winter? And do you use an app, for example, Clear Outside, to work out the dew point prediction? And if so, what temperature? Okay, now firstly, no, I don't use my lens warmers all throughout the winter. I use them when I need them. So for example, sometimes the dew point, Clear Outside is a fantastic app and it does list the dew point, but there's many times when the dew point is listed, let's say at 3 degrees Celsius, and it's about 5 or 6 degrees, and I'm still getting dew. So I can't totally depend on that because that varies depending on all sorts of conditions. For example, if there's any wind or breeze, that will stop dew often. Now, what I do, I always fit my lens hood on my cameras, and I'll look on that lens hood if I can see any dew forming there, because that is my first point of protection for my lens. If I see anything there, I will definitely put my lens warmer on, and because then I know that it's going to get onto that lens very shortly afterwards. I've been burnt too many times. So my answer is I don't use it all the time, but I always have it there handy. I don't necessarily look at the app and say, is it going to be dewy tonight? I know it's probably going to be dewy. I look at the ground and see if there's any around, and that's what I go by. Okay, now Dure Jacklick, hope I got that right. Now, I'm not sure if you've already addressed this, but I'm curious to know when you'd stack short exposures instead of using a tracker. And what do you see as the benefits of one over the other? Although I've managed to use a tracker while creating multi-row panorama with decent results, I find it a pain to set up and then stitch and blend with the foreground. And a less technical question, where do you get your inspiration from? Man, oh man, that last one could take the whole video. Anyway, basically the question there is, would you prefer to stack or track? Now, I've mentioned this a few times. For my workflow, most of the time I prefer to stack shorter exposures. But there is absolutely no doubt that tracked exposures of the night sky and the Milky Way are absolutely gorgeous. And if you want the highest possible image quality for Milky Way photos and nightscape photos, then tracking is definitely the way to go. But as has been suggested here, it is a pain in the backside to blend the foregrounds with the background night sky. More recently, I've been experimenting a little bit with the Photoshop sky replacement algorithm, and it seems to be working pretty well. So I'm going to do some more tracking this year. It's one of the things that I'm committing to do, and I'm going to push myself a little bit hard. I want to try a lot of new things this year, so that's one of them. So for my workflow that I do with my foreground light painted images, stacking is definitely the easier workflow, both in capturing in the field and editing on the computer. Now, your second question, where do I get my inspiration from? You know, that is such a big question, but essentially I love the night sky. I'm inspired every time I go out under the night sky, and that stems from when I was a little kid and I used to sit up on the shed roof at home and I'd stare up at the night sky. I used to love all the old space movies and the documentaries on the Apollo space missions, all sorts of things like that. I just love being out there, and you know, you can just breathe in that beautiful fresh air and not a care in the world. And that's the thing that inspires me. One other thing that inspires me is seeing other people when I'm out shooting with them and they seeing that LCD screen light up with the long exposure photograph of the night sky, and they say, wow, look at that. That inspires me. All right, let's move on. HBF Films. This is a similar question, to be honest. How did you get into astro? Now, firstly, HBF Films have a great YouTube channel here. So look him up. He's got some fantastic material there. I watch his channel quite regularly. Now, how did I get into astro? Well, like I said before, I was only a little boy and I used to get up on the shed roof and I'd stare at the sky, loved it. Now, back then I couldn't take photos like I can today, but I tried, and I'll show you the camera. This is it. This is my mum's Box Brownie camera. Have a look at that. What a beautiful piece of equipment. And you can see I've actually modified this. You can see I've actually araldite it. It's just glued on brackets so I could put it on a tripod. It didn't even have a tripod mount. And the other thing I tried to make a tracker way back when I was a kid out of a clock. I remember pulling this clock apart and I tried to attach it to this thing. Oh gee, I had a lot of fun, but I didn't get any decent photos. But nevertheless, I started my photography journey with this camera, believe it or not. Now, probably in earnest, probably the last 7 or 8 years, I really got into it. Now, I've been a photographer professionally and a video producer for forever, it seems like. And I did a lot of other photography, daytime photography and all sorts of things, but my nightscape photography has always been my passion, as you can see, and now I'm living out my dream. It's not as easy as some people think it is to live your dream. You've got to work very hard to get to that point where you can set aside other things and just do what you want to do. But that's how I got into it, and I'm wrapped. I love what I do. Okay, now Blair Lindsay is asking, how do you overcome the fear of the night? And should I say the fear of animals or people at night? Well, Blair, look, to be honest, I've never had a fear of the night as such. I've just mentioned I used to spend time out under the stars when I was a kid. A lot of people do though, and I totally appreciate that. I think one of the things to keep in mind is there's strength in numbers. If you want to go out at night time shooting the sky, then take somebody with you or go in a group. There's strength in numbers and you feel more confident and capable. Now, the aspect of fear of animals or people, well, people think because I live in Australia, there's crocodiles and there's all sorts of wild snakes and spiders ready to leap at me from every corner. That's not the case. There's not a crocodile between me and 2,000 miles away. And sure, the snakes and spiders are in, but they don't care about me. They just live their own little life and they do their own thing. Because Milky Way season here typically is in the winter time, I don't see anything like that anyway. I do go to locations where there could well be some snakes and spiders and all sorts of things, but hey, they're asleep, they're hibernating. People, well, yeah, people are more dangerous than animals, but having said that, wherever I go at night time, I always go there during the daytime first, have a good idea of where I'm going, look for all the safety concerns, work out if there's any dangers or anything there, and then, you know, I know where I'm going when I get there at night time. Now, if there's a place where I think there might be people mulling around, I don't go there. It's as simple as that. All the places I go to, it's like in the middle of nowhere. And if there was any people around, you'd know they were there because there'd be lights. People don't walk around in the dark in the landscape without lights. So they have torches, headlamps, cars, lanterns, fire, you name it. You can tell when there's people around, and I just don't go there. All right, now Peter Kennington is asking, you mentioned last week, which was probably a few weeks ago, that you prefer the Z6 over the Sony for stills because it has a higher pixel count. He's talking about the Z6 and the Sony a7S III, which I did a video about. Since both are full frame and the Sony has only 12 megapixel, the pixel size will be larger and will be more light sensitive and produce less noise. Is this true? And is a 12 megapixel sensor too small for any reasonable size prints? Well, firstly, I've got a print here, which I did in response to this very question. Now, I can only do a 12 by 18, but this is taken with a Sony a7S III 12 megapixel sensor. It's a beautiful print, 12 by 18, looks absolutely gorgeous. And I've taken quite a few prints with the Z6, as you know, and I can't fault this one at all. It just looks great. Now, it's not as big as I may print. I could only get this one done in the time I had, but the colors look great. The quality looks good. It looks nice and dense. Stars look fantastic. So I've got a few others there as well. The printing is fine. I don't think it's a problem. Now, the majority of people I know that use the 12 megapixel Sony cameras tend to shoot a lot of panoramas. So if you shoot a pano, you've got a whole lot more pixels to play with anyway, so it becomes a moot point. As far as the light gathering power, it's true that the Sony a7S series are very, very light sensitive, and that's the reason I bought the camera for my video production. I'm recording it now. At night time, it's awesome. But you know, the Z6 is awesome. The Canon R series are awesome. There's a lot of cameras that are awesome. Photography is different to video. And because of the shutter speed variations that you can put into photography, I think it's less of an issue. So I would, if I'm buying a new camera, I would definitely go for 24 megapixel or maybe even a bit more. these days. But as you can see, the 12 megapixel prints really well. All right, now Senu, I hope I got that right. Hi Richard, thanks for the amazing content. I have some questions. Do you suggest to astro modify the camera? Which is better between stacking and tracking? And do you have any suggestions to overcome the fear of going outside alone in the nighttime? Okay, well, I've already touched on a couple of these. No, I don't have fear going out alone, but I do have my safety procedures in place. Do I prefer stacking or tracking? Well, at the moment, stacking, but I am going to get more into tracking this year, and I'm going to take you along for that journey, so stay tuned. As far as do I suggest to astro modify the camera? Well, this was my first astro modified camera all those years ago. Not very successful, but I'm thinking about it. I've got a few friends who have done it recently, and I've had some discussions with different people, and it might be one of the things I branch into. I don't know. I'm going to have to sell another arm and a leg if I want to do that, but we'll see how we go. Now, Tom S is asking, would a 14 to 24 f2.8 or a 14 to 30 f4 also do the job for nightscape photography? Or is an f1.8 lens really needed? Okay, Tom, now what Tom's talking about here is the Nikon 14 to 30 f4 landscape lens. It's a fantastic lens. Or the 14 to 24 f2.8. Now, I have actually got loaned at this very moment the Nikon 14 to 24 f2.8s lens, and I'm doing a bit of a trial test with that lens to see how it goes for nightscape. So stay tuned for that. I prefer the prime lenses, but not just because they're f1.8. I love the focal length. Now, if you follow my channel, you know that I hardly ever shoot with the 14mm lens. I have done, but I've got one. I've got a 14 to 24 f2.8, the old F mount. And the only time I ever drag it out is if I'm going to do time lapse. And the advantage of having a very wide field of view is because I've got to crop a time lapse to a 16:9 aspect ratio. So I'm losing real estate. So I do like to have that, but it's a big, heavy lens. I don't like big, heavy lenses. I'm trying to compact everything down. That's why I love these mirrorless cameras so much. And the prime lenses are smaller and lighter, and I love them. You know, I don't always shoot them at f1.8, but I can shoot them at f1.8, and that is a great advantage. So the question is, can I still use, say, for example, a 14 to 30 f4 and shoot nightscapes? Of course you can. And I know quite a few people that use that very lens and get great results. But you have to bump up the ISO a bit more than you would say if you were shooting at f1.8, f2, f2.2, or even f2.8. So there's certainly a time and a place to use these lenses. Now the zoom lens is very multifunctional, particularly for daytime shooting and landscapes in particular. But for nightscapes, like I said, I love the 20mm. If I can get away, I'll shoot with the 35, even a 50mm lens. I love those prime lenses. If I could find a cheap, lightweight, fast aperture 14mm or 15mm lens, I'd buy it as well, because I could still use that for my time lapses and maybe star trials. But the big, heavy lenses, no, I'm not buying those anymore. All right, now let's move on. Guy Dryas, hope I got that right. Guy Dryas. From a Nikon D750 to the Z6, how did the upgrade affect your photography? Improvement, image quality, faster shooting, easier focusing at night, was it worth it? So I went from a Nikon D750 to a Z6. Now I still have a couple of D750s, great camera. It did affect my photography. The Nikon Z6 is a better camera in every regard except for one, and that is battery life. The D750 is better. A little bit longer battery life, but that's about the only thing. The Z6 is better in every other way, and particularly the Z S mount lenses. They are fantastic when coupled with the Z mount camera. Is there an improvement in image quality? Well, only marginal. The D750 is a fantastic camera with a really good lens attached. Is it faster shooting or easier focusing? No, not really. I'd say it's pretty much exactly the same, and editing is pretty much exactly the same as well. So if budget is a problem, the D750 is still a great option. Okay, Stefan, now this has got to be the most important question of the whole video. Stefan is asking, what is your average rum ball consumption rate per night? Well, you know I love my rum balls. When I go to the bakery to buy rum balls, I always buy 2. But when I'm out at night shooting and I have my cup of tea and a rum ball, I only ever consume 1 per night. Now I have 1 left over. Now rum balls, they're pretty filling, and you know, you probably don't want to be consuming too much rum while you're out there shooting the night sky. So 1 is my average, but I always buy 2 when I go to the shop. Christopher Pitstock is asking, "Hi Richard, I love your content. Thank you very much. What I would like to know is how you decide what ISO to use. I note that you often use 6400, but do you drop it sometimes for your Milky Way shots?" Yeah, I do drop it sometimes, and I've shot everywhere between 1600 up to 10,000, probably even more. Depends on ambient light levels. I often shoot in a very dark sky locations, and that's where the high ISOs come into their own, because I'm not gathering too much ambient light and light pollution. Also, it depends on what camera and lens you use, and it also depends whether you've got an ISO invariant sensor in your camera. So for example, on the Nikon I shoot, and the Sony for that matter, they're both ISO invariant cameras, so I can shoot at a lower ISO and just boost it in post and get pretty much a similar result. If you shoot with a Canon camera, I tend to suggest shooting at a higher ISO in camera, so you don't have to boost too much, because what happens if you don't have an ISO invariant sensor, you'll get a lot of that purple fringing. It's not pleasant, doesn't look good. You don't have to shoot at ISO 6400, but for my kit and my setup and the dark sky locations where I shoot, I find it works well for me. If you're in a light polluted area, you will find you may have to drop that ISO down a couple of stops perhaps. It just depends on where you are. It's a hard answer, that one, because it depends on a lot of things. Now, David Atkinson is asking, "Hi Richard, would love to see more of your lighting aspects of your photos whilst doing the shot. For example, how long do you keep the light on the subject when moving around, and if you have the torch on wide or zoomed?" Always good to see how you do your fixed lighting as well. So he's talking about low level lighting there. Any processing videos of your shots are also gold. Well, thanks a lot, David. I appreciate that. It's really hard for me to actually show you live on a video how long I light paint things. 1, it's extremely difficult to record video at night time, and 2, the amount of light is hard to see on a video. The 3 factors determine how much light goes on a subject. 1, how bright the torch is. 2, how far the torch is from the subject matter. And 3, how long the light source is actually on for. All of those will impact on the amount of light. Typically, let's say I'm doing a 15-second shutter speed, I might only light paint for 3 or 4 seconds max. But all of those other factors come into it. Now, I will do more processing on these post-processing videos. I'll also do more in the field videos, trying to show you in real time how I go about it, David. So I appreciate you watching. Now, Bob G. "Hi Richard, to process your excellent nightscapes and videos, do you use an off-the-shelf computer or did you build one? And what specs do you suggest at minimum? What people consider when shopping for either computer components or an already built unit for their image processing and content creation?" Well, Bob, I don't build my own computers. I don't know much about computers at all. I've always had off-the-shelf units. Now, currently I'm using a laptop, a HP Omen 15-inch laptop. Previously, I've always had desktop computers. Now, I would suggest desktop computers are a better option in most cases because they're cheaper to buy and they're quieter, and you can fit more in them in the typical space, and the components are cheaper. Now, the laptop I'm using is quite good. It's an i7 processor. It's got 16 gig of RAM and a SSD hard drive, so it's fast and everything else. But my previous computer was nearly just as good. It was an i5 processor. It wasn't anything great. I'm using Windows, as you can tell. And off-the-shelf stuff is fantastic. I mean, you don't have to buy the budget, but you don't have to buy the best there is either. When I bought the laptop, there was the one I bought's a gaming computer, but I've had a few problems with it, and I wouldn't suggest necessarily going straight to a laptop for editing and computer use. It's a good machine, but it's noisy. The fan's always going flat out. Things like that. I don't know if it's got the shelf life of a desktop. So as far as building computers, there's people who know far more than I do. So that's about my best I can give you. Royston Palmer. Royston's a great legend. Now, well, Richard, on a previous video, you briefly mentioned a process for stacked panos. It's something I've been looking at doing and using Sequator to stack a number of shots for noise reduction, and then using all those shots to create the final pano. It would be great if you could do a post-processing tutorial on this method alone. Currently, I use single shots for panos, but want a more cleaner image using this method. So, Royston and everybody else, Yeah, I mainly do my panoramas with single images, but there's been a few where I've stacked multiple images for each panel of the panorama. Now it is time consuming, both in the field and in post-processing. There's a lot more steps to go through. But yes, you do get a cleaner image. It's just a few things to keep in mind. Now, the stars obviously are moving, so the longer it takes you to take all of those panels, there's a fair bit of movement between the first one and the last one. So there's other things you can do. You can take tracked panoramas of the night sky as well, which adds a further layer of complication, but the quality increase is dramatic. So I will be doing more videos on this very topic, Royston, so if you can hang in there, I'll see if I can come up with something. By the way, typically I do mostly single panel panoramas, fairly big overlap, and the quality's pretty good. All right, now William Young. Hi Richard, I'm sure you've done this before, but a video on how you stitch a pano foreground and then add in the sky. Your videos are top class and I've learned so much from them. Well, I really appreciate that, William. So what William's talking about there is when I do a separate pano for the night sky to the foreground. Typically I would do that because the foreground is very dark, and so I'd use longer exposures to get the shadow detail out of the foreground. In fact, my favourite video from 2020, which was the Childers Cove panorama, was done exactly that way, where I did my 15-second shutter speeds for the sky pano, created that, then did 60-second or 1 minute exposures for the foreground, created that as a separate pano and blended them, stitched them together. So that's the manual operation in Photoshop. So what I'll do, I'll do more videos on that. I actually haven't done a video showing you the post-processing steps for that. So that's one that I will definitely put on the list along with Royston. So there's a bit of panorama stuff happening here. Been quite a few questions on panos. Okay, now Don Huff has asked a question. First, thank you for what you do in educating and entertaining us. Well, Don, I hope it's entertaining. Sometimes I just feel like I'm waffling on, but anyway. Multiple row panos are still a bit of a mystery to me. Well, obviously they are for a lot of people because we've got a lot of questions about panoramas. How do you adjust the camera when you go to take the top row when using a ball head and keep everything level? Okay, so this is what I've been saying a lot in my videos on panoramas. I use the inbuilt level on the camera. Also, I level the tripod as much as I can with the bubble level. So I get my tripod very level first. If you can do that, then when you turn the camera around this way, it stays level when you go around. But what I do is I enable the inbuilt level in the camera. Now, pretty much every camera has a built-in spirit level, and I make sure that that is level on every single row. So I go to the bottom row, then I take it up to the top row, overlap my about 50% or so by a long way, make sure that level is level in the camera all the way around, next row, etc. That's how I do it. And it seems to work quite well for me. I don't use any special panorama heads or anything like that. I just use the inbuilt level on the camera. Now, Rob Upsall, first year astro shooter here. Have a 14mm lens looking to get a 20mm, or is one, say, 14 to 30 better? Basically, is a prime better than the zoom? Well, we've already pretty much talked about this. In my opinion, a prime lens is a better option just for nightscapes or astro work. But if you're doing landscapes and other photographic genres, then a zoom lens is probably a better option. To be honest, you really need lenses for different things. So in this case, you might want a 14 to 30. The Nikon 14 to 30 f4 is a beautiful lens for landscape. And then a 20mm f1.8 for nightscapes. That's what I would suggest. That's what I would use for sure. I said in my earlier response, I don't even hardly ever use a 14mm lens anymore. Now, when people start, now Rob's a first year astro shooter, when people start, they nearly always go for a really extreme ultra wide angle lens, like a 14, 15 or 16. I did the same thing. I bought a Samyang 14mm f2.8 because that's what everyone else said to use. I hated that lens. I never really enjoyed that lens at all. And I've had two of those, and I've currently still got the Nikon 14 to 24, but I never use it. The only time I use it, as I said, is for time lapses. So when I got the 20mm, it was like, man, why didn't I get this lens? It is so good. It's still an ultra wide lens. It is awesome. It's a beautiful lens. Rarely do I ever need anything wider than 20, but that is my opinion. Other people will have their own views on that. So you can take that as you will. Now, Mark McGuinness, Problems that can arise from panoramas, another panorama question, with chroma, distortion, issues in the corners of the images when you try to stitch them together. I know this has been a problem for some panos I've tried in the past where the software just can't stitch the images together because of the lens distortions of different varieties. Now, that's a really common problem. And a lot of the problems is because people are using ultra wide angle lenses, which are really distorted on the edges. For example, I was just talking about 14mm lenses. They have a lot of distortion on the corners. Less so as you go up. So 20mm lens, less 24, 35, 50. A lot of people will recommend using, say, a 24, 35 or 50mm lenses for panoramas because of the lack of distortion, and they stitch better. You just got to take a lot more pictures to get the same area of coverage. The other thing I would strongly suggest is overlapping a long way. I overlap at least 50%, sometimes more. So therefore, the software has a whole lot more chance of stitching accurately because it's seeing more of each image overlapping the next one down. So that's my suggestion. I don't know what camera and lens you're using, Mark. That would come into it, obviously. So if you're using a crop sensor camera, then they crop into a lens more. So there's a little bit less distortion in the corners for the same given focal length. Now, Carl McNeil. I think you may have touched on this one in one of your videos, but what is your method for dodging and burning? Also, how long does it normally take to do a full edit when blending multiple images together? All right, Carl. Now it may surprise some of you to know that I don't do your typical dodging and burning at all in my Nightscapes. So dodging and burning is a process whereby you will make fine adjustments on for example, dark areas and light areas, and dodge and burn them and bring those bits out and soften other bits, individual little bits and pieces in for example, the Milky Way. I don't do that. I much prefer to do a global edit on Milky Ways. One thing I don't like with editing of particularly the Milky Way core is this cigar-shaped Milky Way core that just stretches through a black sky. It just doesn't look realistic. It doesn't look right. I don't like it, and I won't do it. I tend to like to edit the whole sky as a global adjustment and go from there. Now, there's certain ways you can do that for example, in Photoshop, you can use curves and levels adjustments, layers, and that does a similar thing to dodging and burning in the sense, but it's more of a global setting, so you don't get these really sharp edges on the Milky Way, etc. You know, it's hard to talk about that without describing it. Also, you can use in Lightroom the dehaze slider, and you can use that as a brush local adjustment. I tend to do that, but not just on the core. I'll do it on the whole sky, and that brings a sense of, I guess, bringing out the dynamics of the shadows and the mid-tones and things like that. So I don't do dodging and burning in a classic sense, as you would say in a daytime landscape. And how long does it take me to do a full edit? Well, I've done lots of editing videos on this channel, and you can go through those. But in my opinion, a faster edit is always a good edit. I don't like spending hours and hours and hours on one image. I think I get too tired, I get too stressed about it, or I much prefer to create a new image and keep going back to an old one over and over and over. But having said that, I think it is a really good idea to, once you've done some editing on an image, sometimes to just go away and come back and look at it with fresh eyes. In fact, sometimes it's good to sleep on it, wake up the next day, come back, you've got a fresh set of eyes to look at that image, and you'll either say, yes, I love it the way it is, or I've got to change something. That's fine. I think we all do that, and I think it's beneficial to do that, because the longer you edit an image, the more it starts to get tangled up and your brain starts to go sideways. That's how I am anyway. Now, one last question. I appreciate that you've stuck with me for so long. Lee Casey Cameron. Now, Lee's a good friend of mine and a very good photographer. She says, I had to rack my brain, but something I've often wondered, she's racking her brain about a question. What would be more beneficial, e.g. less noise, reduced banding, etc., if you were to compare images, foreground images of, say, a 4-minute long exposure versus several 20 or 30-second exposures? Is one better than the other, and if so, why? Ignoring, obviously, trailing stars. Yeah, I get it. But it's irrelevant if taken separately and the sky is then stacked. So, if, for instance, you used the typical star trail settings but lowered the ISO to, say, 500, Would this help to obtain more colour and less overexposed stars for post-processing? I'm keen to see your thoughts on the colourful star trails. Okay, I'll talk about the star trails in a minute, but initially Lee's question is it better to take a long exposure foreground of say 2, 3, 4 minutes, or is it better to take a whole stack of shorter, say 20 or 30 second exposures of the foreground and stack them for noise reduction? There's no easy answer, but both methods work, and I've used both methods. So for example, if I'm taking a long exposure of the foreground, separate to the sky, we're talking here, and I leave my shutter open for a long time, it obviously gathers more light. Therefore, there's more exposure, and when you have more exposure, you have inherently less noise. So noise often hides in the shadowy areas. Now, to take that a little step further, what you can do is take, let's say 2-minute exposures. You might take 4 of them and stack them, and then you get an even cleaner noise because you're getting rid of the noise that's inherently in any of these long exposure images. So both methods work, and sometimes I've used both in the same image where I could have 2 or 3 minute exposures to get the distant foreground, and then I stack closer foreground stuff that maybe I'm doing a bit of light painting or something with, and blend them all together, and then blend that with the sky. So you can do all of the above. I don't think there's one that's necessarily better than the other. I think it's a matter of using whichever one is the best for that particular scene. But there's no doubt that that long foreground exposure, say your 2, 3, 4 minutes, works a treat. Now the last part of the question is about star trails. Now, I think what Lee's referring to are these very rich, colourful star trails that seem to have become a fashionable thing the last couple of years. Generally speaking, the lower the ISO that you have when you're shooting star trails, or stars in general, the more colour that you will retain. And that's because of dynamic range. Now, dynamic range is the difference between black and white in an image. And the more you ramp up the ISO, the more you're compressing your dynamic range, in fact lowering the ability of your camera to capture the bright whites and the dark blacks. So therefore, you're squashing all that, you're blowing the highlights, and that's not what you want to get colour out of the night sky. So yeah, typically you would lower your ISO as much as you can, and you always run into this dilemma of having either a well-exposed image or too dark of an image. And there's not much you can do about that except increase the shutter speed. Now with star trails, that's one thing you can do. You can increase the shutter speed. You don't have to be stuck to your 20-second or your 30-second exposure. You can go to 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. You can do whatever you want. And therefore you can drop your ISO right down. So your dynamic range is not squashed in anymore, and you're still getting the colour. So that's the best of both worlds as far as I'm concerned. As far as the coloured star trails that we often see, there's a lot of post-processing goes into those images to get them to look as that most people would crank up the vibrance and saturation an awful long way to make sure they highlight the colours. But in essence, that's a good thing to do, is to keep your ISO down when you're shooting star trails. All right, well that's our Q&A session done and dusted. I think I've done enough talking for one video. It's the first for the new year, so we'll see how we go. But look, thank you so much for tuning in once again. I'd love you to subscribe to the channel. Leave comments down below. Always happy to chat with you about anything to do with this video or any of my other videos. And I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Have a fantastic time. See you later.